You open the fridge without thinking. That's the thing nobody talks about. You just open it. Your hand reaches for the door handle, the light comes on, and there's food inside. Cold, organized, waiting. You grab what you need and move on with your morning. Most people do that every single day without ever stopping to wonder what would happen if it wasn't there. Not in a dramatic, catastrophic way. Just quietly ask yourself, how many of the things I consider guaranteed right now depend on a chain I have never seen, never touched, and couldn't replace if it broke? The food in your fridge traveled an average of 1,500 miles to get to you. The water coming out of your tap passes through infrastructure that hasn't been significantly updated in most American cities since the 1970s. The electricity powering your lights, your refrigerator, your phone runs through a grid that experiences over 3,000 significant outages across the United States every single year. None of that is meant to scare you. Fear isn't the point here. The point is something quieter and more important than fear. It's the recognition that somewhere along the way, most of us traded a certain kind of knowledge for convenience. We traded the ability to produce for the ability to consume. And the deal seemed so obviously good at the time that nobody really noticed what we gave up. I didn't notice either. For a long time, I thought self-sufficiency was just a personality type. Something for people who like the idea of living off-grid, raising chickens, making everything from scratch. I respected it the way you respect a hobby that isn't yours. Interesting, just not for me. And then one summer, the power went out for 4 days. Nothing dramatic. A storm, a downed line, a repair crew stretched thin across 3 counties. 4 days without power in July with a young kid in the house. What surprised me wasn't the inconvenience. What surprised me was how quickly things I considered reliable became things I was rationing. Ice for the cooler, water for washing, food that was still safe to eat. I had a car, a credit card, a phone with a dying battery. And I still spent those 4 days feeling more vulnerable than I'd expected to feel. That feeling didn't go away when the power came back. It just sat there quietly, asking a question I didn't have a good answer for. If this channel has been helping you think differently about how you live and what you depend on, subscribe right now. I put out content like this every week, and what's coming next builds directly on what we're talking about today. Here's what I eventually understood. The people who aren't rattled by moments like that aren't survivalists or preppers in the Hollywood sense. They're not waiting for collapse. They're people who built systems, small ones mostly, practical ones. Systems that don't replace the modern world, but quietly run alongside it, reducing dependence in the specific places where dependence creates vulnerability. And what I found when I started looking into how those systems worked was something I genuinely didn't expect. The blueprint for this kind of resilience isn't new. It isn't a product of the modern self-sufficiency movement or some recent trend in sustainable living. It's something much older, something that generations of ordinary families understood not as a philosophy, but simply as how you operated. And it disappeared not because it stopped working, but because a different model became available. One that solved the short-term problem so efficiently that it buried the long-term cost. That cost is what we're going to talk about today. The blueprint I want to walk you through is called the root system. Not a brand, not a program. Just a name for a set of principles that I've seen work, that I've watched people build, and that I've started implementing myself piece by piece. It's built around a simple idea that a home, even a small one, even an urban or suburban one, can function as a living system rather than just a consumption point. That the things you need most, food, water, energy, can be partially produced where you live rather than entirely imported from somewhere else. The difference that shift makes is not just practical, it's psychological, and that second part matters more than people expect. But before we get into how it works, I want to spend a moment on why this knowledge disappeared, because understanding that changes how you see the whole thing. For most of human history, the family unit was also a production unit, not self-contained or isolated. Families traded, borrowed, shared, sold, but the home itself produced something. Food from a garden or a small flock, preserved goods for winter, water from a well or a rain barrel, heat from wood that was cut and stored. These weren't romantic choices. They were the obvious logic of survival. You built redundancy into your life because depending entirely on systems outside your control simply wasn't viable. What changed wasn't human ingenuity. What changed was the supply chain. When industrialized food production scaled, when municipal water and electrical grids expanded, when refrigeration made it possible to move perishables across thousands of miles, the old logic stopped making economic sense. Why keep a garden when the grocery store stocks everything cheaper and faster? The individual calculations were rational, every single one of them, and yet the sum of all those rational choices produced something nobody explicitly designed, an almost total transfer of production capacity away from the home and into a system the home now depends on entirely. That's not a conspiracy. It just emerged from a million practical decisions made over about 60 years. But here's the part I find genuinely interesting. The knowledge didn't vanish. It didn't burn in a library fire. It just stopped being passed down. It became the province of hobbyists and historians and rural communities that never fully made the transition. And because it stopped being passed down, most people today genuinely don't know that an alternative exists. Not as a romantic fantasy, as a practical, scalable, working system. Now, if you want to go deeper on everything I'm covering in this video, there's a complete resource in the description and in the first comment. It covers the full blueprint with detailed guidance on building each layer, what to start with, how to scale without overwhelming yourself. The link is down there. But keep watching because the architecture of how this actually works is what makes it click, and we're just getting to that part. Let's start with what I call the stability base. Every version of the root system I've seen that actually works starts the same way. Not with the most exciting parts, not with fish tanks or biodigesters or elaborate integrated gardens. It starts with the foundation, the parts of the system that reduce your vulnerability in the most immediate ways. The stability base has three components: power, water, and food proximity, and each one is simpler than the version most people imagine. On power, a hybrid solar setup doesn't mean you're going off-grid. It means you have a partial buffer, a system sized to keep your refrigerator, your lights, your essential devices running through a 48-hour outage doesn't require a large investment. Entry-level systems have come down dramatically in price over the last decade, and smaller setups can be installed in a weekend. You're not replacing the grid. You're creating a margin, a gap between you and the point where everything stops. What that margin does to your psychology is harder to describe until you experience it. There's a before and after. The before is a background tension you don't notice until it's gone. The after is a quieter confidence. Nothing changed dramatically. You just stopped being entirely dependent on something you can't influence at all. Water redundancy works the same way. Two 55-gallon tanks plumbed to your gutters with a basic filtration setup means you have roughly 110 gallons available from a single modest rainfall event. Scale that slightly, and you have enough for genuine household use. The point isn't to never pay a water bill again. The point is to have something when the tap stops being reliable. Food proximity is the third element, and the one people underestimate most consistently, not because of what it produces, but because of what it teaches. Growing food close to your kitchen, even in containers, even in 20 square feet of sunny wall space, changes your relationship to the supply chain in ways that are difficult to overstate. You start noticing seasonality. You start understanding growing cycles. You start making decisions about what to plant that have downstream effects on the rest of the system. It's not about the lettuce, it's about the learning. The stability base isn't glamorous, but it's the reason the rest of the system can exist. Without these three foundations, everything else you build is vulnerable to the same disruptions you were vulnerable to before. And here's where something shifts. Once you have the base, you start thinking differently. You start looking at things that seemed like separate problems and noticing they're connected. The water that runs off your roof becomes something you see differently. The kitchen scraps you throw in the trash become something with potential. Sunlight falling on your south-facing wall stops being just light and becomes an unconverted resource. That shift in perception, from seeing the world as a collection of consumable objects to seeing it as a set of flows and cycles you can participate in. That's the real transformation the stability base produces. Everything we're about to get into builds on that shift. The second layer is what I call the root core, and this is where the biology happens. Think for a moment about what a healthy ecosystem actually does. A forest floor takes the dead leaves, fallen branches, animal waste, runoff, and converts all of it into fertility. Nothing is wasted in the sense that it disappears without contributing to the next cycle. The system is essentially a closed loop, constantly converting what would otherwise be loss into the raw material for new growth. That's not a metaphor for what the root core does. That's literally what it does. The root core is built around 3 integrated cycles: aquatic systems, intensive soil cultivation, and composting. These 3 cycles, when connected to each other, generate a biological engine that feeds the rest of the system with very little input from outside. Start with aquaculture, because it's the piece that surprises people most. A modest tank of fish, even a 300-gallon setup in a garage or small greenhouse, produces 2 things simultaneously. It produces protein, obviously, but it also produces fertilized water. Every hour that tank is running, fish waste breaks down into a nutrient-rich solution. That is, without any additional processing, one of the most effective liquid fertilizers you can apply to plants. Connect that to the soil beds. Run the tank water through your growing areas, and those plants receive consistent nutrition with 0 purchased input. The plants take up the nutrients. The water returns cleaner. The fish live in healthier water because the plants are processing their waste. You've built a loop that, once it's balanced, runs largely on its own. But what feeds the fish? This is where composting enters, specifically what I think of as the living composting layer. Black soldier fly larvae are extraordinary composters. They process organic waste at a rate conventional composting can't match and produce a dense, protein-rich biomass that goes directly back to the fish, or to chickens if you have them, or processed into a soil amendment that rivals commercial fertilizer. So you have a cycle. Organic waste feeds the larvae. Larvae feed the fish. Fish waste feeds the plants. Plants produce food. Food waste returns to the larvae. And at no point in that loop did you need to purchase inputs or discharge anything into a waste system. That's not a futuristic technology. Black soldier fly composting is ancient in the sense that the flies have been doing this without human assistance for millions of years. It largely disappeared from common practice when municipal waste systems made it unnecessary to think about what happened to food scraps after they left the kitchen. The root core, at its most basic, is the deliberate rebuilding of a biological loop that already exists in nature. You're not inventing anything. You're positioning yourself inside a cycle that was always already there. If you've been building this mental picture as I'm describing it, and you're finding it genuinely useful, subscribe to this channel and drop a comment below telling me which part of this system surprised you most. I read all of them. The conversations that happen in the comments on videos like this one are some of the most valuable exchanges I've had on this topic. The third layer is what I call the engine layer, and I want to be honest before I describe it. This is the part that most people either overinvest in too early or ignore entirely because it seems too technical. Both are expensive mistakes. The engine layer is not where you start, it's what you add once the root core is running. The engine layer has 3 primary components: thermal composting, biodigestion, and long-term food preservation. Thermal composting is different from the standard variety most people know. When you build a compost pile correctly, with the right ratio of carbon to nitrogen, the right moisture level and adequate mass, it generates heat, significant heat. A well-managed thermal system sustains internal temperatures of 130 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to kill pathogens and weed seeds, and hot enough to process material in weeks rather than months. Working implementations have used coil systems buried inside compost piles to heat water for household use. That's not fringe science. That's thermodynamics applied to a biological process. Biodigestion takes the principle further. A biodigester processes organic waste in an anaerobic environment, producing 2 outputs: a nutrient-dense liquid fertilizer called digestate, and biogas, primarily methane, which can be captured and used as a cooking fuel. A small household biodigester fed consistently with kitchen waste and material from the aquatic system, can produce enough gas to meaningfully offset cooking fuel costs. The technology is over a century old and has been used extensively in rural communities across India, China, and sub-Saharan Africa for generations. It largely disappeared from the American context because cheap natural gas made the economics unfavorable. The economics are changing. Long-term food preservation is the third component and the one with the most immediate practical return. Fermentation requires no electricity, no special equipment, no purchased inputs. Salt, vegetables, water, and time. The output is food that can last months at room temperature, with increased nutritional bioavailability compared to the raw input. Dehydration works alongside it. A basic solar dehydrator, built from salvaged materials in an afternoon, uses ambient heat and airflow to preserve herbs, fruits, vegetables, and mushrooms for months without refrigeration. Together, these three components do something the earlier layers can't do alone. They create continuity. They allow the system to produce abundance during the high season and maintain that abundance when production drops. That's the difference between a garden and a food system. A garden gives you food in summer. A system gives you food in February. Now I want to stop here for a moment because there's something I've been building toward that I think needs to be said directly. Everything I've described, the stability base, the root core, the engine layer, it sounds like a lot. I understand that reaction completely, because the first time I tried to hold the whole picture in my head at once, I felt the same way. It felt like a project for someone with more land, more money, more time, more knowledge than I had. But here's what I've actually seen when I've watched people build this. Nobody builds it all at once. Nobody starts with the whole blueprint. You start with one thing, usually the thing that addresses the vulnerability you feel most acutely. A small solar setup, a rain barrel, a single raised bed next to the kitchen door. And that one thing, if it's built correctly, starts showing you the connections to everything else. The system reveals itself incrementally. That's how it's supposed to work. And I want to push back against the fantasy version of this conversation, which is the one where self-sufficiency looks like a beautiful farm, a fully stocked root cellar, solar panels on every roof, and a family that never buys groceries. That version exists for some people, but it's not the blueprint. The blueprint is much more modest and much more accessible. It's about reducing your dependency in measurable, practical ways without rebuilding your life from scratch. The trade-off is real, though. I want to be honest about that. Managing this system takes time. Not enormous amounts of it, but consistent amounts. The fish tank needs monitoring. The compost needs turning. The garden needs weeding. You don't eliminate work by building this. You redirect it. You stop spending time earning money to pay bills you could partially eliminate, and you start spending time maintaining systems that reduce those bills. Whether that trade makes sense for your life is a question only you can answer. But the people I've talked to who have built real, imperfect, partial versions of this system, they describe the change in similar terms. Less anxiety about money. Less anxiety about what the news is doing to grocery prices. A quieter kind of connection to their home and their food, and the basic rhythms of how things grow. Something in the background that used to feel uncertain starts to feel more stable. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but genuinely different. There's something else that comes up consistently that I didn't expect when I started paying attention to this. The people who build these systems become resources for their communities in the small, quiet way that actually matters during a disruption. When the power goes out for 4 days and you're the house on the block with working refrigeration and a full water tank and extra food, something shifts. Not dramatically, but it shifts. You become someone who can help rather than someone who needs help. That's a different kind of resilience than the purely individual kind. It's the kind that creates real bonds between neighbors, the kind that actually made communities function through hard times for most of human history. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep exploring this. Drop a like on this video if it's making you think, and leave a comment telling me what part of this landed most differently than you expected. I genuinely want to know, and this conversation gets better the more people are part of it. Here's the thing about the root system that I keep coming back to. It's not a rejection of the modern world. That framing turns people away before they've really considered what's being offered. The people building these systems are not escaping civilization. They're using what civilization has given them, better materials, better information, better tools, to do something civilization quietly stopped teaching them to do. The people of 1890 didn't have access to efficient photovoltaic panels or well-documented polyculture aquaculture systems. They had the knowledge of cycles and production and preservation that we've largely lost. We have the technology and materials they didn't have. The combination of those two things is genuinely powerful in a way neither era could achieve alone. And that's the real promise of the root system. Not that it takes you back to some imagined simpler time, but that it moves you forward into something more integrated and more resilient than what either the past or the present has offered on its own. Imagine what your daily life looks like 12 months into building this. Not fully built, not finished. Nothing like this is ever finished. But 12 months in, you wake up and walk to the kitchen window. Outside, in the beds you built last spring, there's growth. Not a farm, just beds. Greens and herbs and the things that do well in your specific soil and your specific light. You make coffee, and the morning feels a little different than it used to. Not dramatically, but there's something quieter about it. A background hum that isn't anxiety about prices or supply chains. You go out and check the tank. The fish are active, the water is clear. The overflow is running through the beds the way it's supposed to. You pull a handful of spent plant material and add it to the compost. You note without stress that the biodigester is due for a feeding. You do that in the evening, maybe 15 minutes. It's just part of the rhythm now. In the afternoon there's a storm warning. A strong one. You check the battery level on the solar system. Full. You check the water tanks. Full. You look at what's in the preservation jars and the dehydrated stores and realize without dramatic calculation that your family could eat well for weeks without a trip to the grocery store. Not forever. Not in a bunker. Just for a while. Just enough. That margin, that gap between you and the point where things get difficult, that's what the whole system exists to create. It's not freedom from the world. It's a different relationship with it. One where you're a participant in production rather than purely a dependent consumer. One where the complexity of the systems that keep your life running is something you understand from the inside rather than just trust from the outside. The internet taught us how to find information instantly, how to order anything from anywhere, how to access knowledge previous generations would have considered miraculous. But it also, quietly, made most of that knowledge feel optional, made it possible to know everything about how food is grown without ever needing to grow it. The cost of not knowing became invisible because the systems that compensated for not knowing became so efficient, so reliable, so cheap, until they weren't. And when they weren't, even briefly, even in small ways, the question that came up was always the same. What do I actually know how to do? What can I produce? What do I have that doesn't depend on something I can't control? The root system is an answer to that question. Not a complete one, not a perfect one, but a real one, a practical one. Built by people who asked that question seriously and built something that worked. You don't have to start big. You don't have to start with all of it. You just have to start with the one piece that makes the most sense for where you are right now. One bed, one tank, one panel, one barrel, and then follow the logic forward because the system will show you what comes next. That's always been how it worked, long before the internet existed to hide it. If this video shifted something in how you think about your home, your food, your relationship to the systems you depend on, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. It genuinely helps this content reach more people asking the same questions. And leave a comment. What's the first piece of this system you're going to look into? I want to see what you're building.